Hi, and welcome back to Kohelet. This week, I want to talk about death. What I mean by that is, I want to talk about the significance of the concept of death in our life and the effect that it has on Kohelet's train of thought and the points that he's been making the previous few weeks and over the course of the previous few verses. People don't always realize the great role, the strong significance that death has over how we contemplate and how we see life. Think about how different your life would be if you lived forever. Number one, you'd be bored to death. Well, not bored to death, but you'd be very bored because you would have forever to do anything and everything you wanted, and you'd be doing everything over and over and over again. So you'd be tremendously bored. But that's not the real point that I want to make. What would happen is if your life could be lived forever, it wouldn't have the value that it does. A great part of the value that our life has, and life is the most valuable thing we have. It's more valuable than anything we have because it's our entire experience and it's really everything we have. And a great part of life's value comes from the fact that we lose it. And it's so fleeting and it's so easy to lose, and we lose it so quickly. And because life is very finite, that's the reason why life has all of the value it has. All of the experiences we have in life, all of what we can accomplish in life, all of the connections we make in life, everything we do in life disappears when we're gone. Our life is no longer there, and everything that was part of our life is no longer there. So our life becomes extremely valuable because of the fact that it doesn't last forever, because of the fact that it disappears at a certain point in time. And that colors everything that happens in our life. So there are two sides to the coin here. On the one hand, death is a supremely terrible thing. It's the worst thing that happens to us because everything disappears. But at the same time, it has tremendous value in a paradoxical sense, because death is what gives value to everything that we have in life. So there's two sides of the coin. There's the terrible tragedy of death, and there's the supreme extreme value of life. And not only that, but death really colors everything that happens in our life. People don't always realize, but a lot of the anxieties and the stresses and the issues and the difficulties we have in life, much of it can be traced back to the fact that we lose life after death. There's a really famous book by Ernest Becker called The Denial of Death, and it goes into this in great detail. You're welcome to take a look at it. But the point of a lot of this is that if we think about this deeply, we'll realize that if we would live forever, and if we could do everything as long as we wanted, and live it over and over again, and live our experiences and change our experiences as many times as we wanted, much of the issues and many of the issues and difficulties that we would face in life would change completely. And so a lot of what colors many of our issues in life is the fact that we die at the end of our life. Not only that, but many of the ethical and moral thinkers throughout history have counseled us to think about death. Why? Because when we think about death, it puts our life into a different framework. It highlights and it puts into focus the significance of our life, and it puts our life into an entirely different framework when we think about the fact that it ends with death. And so death plays a really important role in our life. It's very bad, and yet at the same time, it's what makes life very good. Someone once told me that they were having a hard time getting over the death of a loved one. Somebody they had been very close to had died months before, and they grieved for a while, but they couldn't get over it. Time had passed, and it just stuck with them, and they could not get past that. And they were asking me what they could do about this, and what is this all about? And I told this person, think about it for a moment. Think about what this means. Because there are people who have relatives or friends or people that are close to them in life. And when that person passes, it hurts a little bit. And then they get over it. And it doesn't affect them the same way that it's affected you. But what does that mean? That means that that person was, in a certain sense, less special to that person. Or, on the other hand, more special to you, right? The fact that this really bothers you, that this really means something very, very significant to you, that tells you how special this person was to you. That tells you how valuable this person was in your life. That signifies to you the special nature of this person to you. And there's no way to get away from the two sides of this equation. For somebody to be special, their absence is going to hurt. And if the absence of somebody or something hurts, that's what makes them special. There's no way to separate and divide the two in our universe, because having something is good when its absence is negative. And not having something is difficult when having it is valuable. And so the fact that something really hurts you when it's missing, and somebody that was close to you is just so difficult for you when they're not there, that tells you how special that person was to you. And that means that when they were there, they really were special to you. Because if it wouldn't be difficult for you now, that would mean that the person wasn't as special to you then. And so think about that and realize how the sadness that you're experiencing now is making and means that that person was special and close to you. And to me, that signifies, that really encapsulates and encompasses the point that we're making here. Death is a very difficult thing, but it's what makes life special. And life is a very special thing, and it wouldn't be as special if it wouldn't be followed by death. Okay, enough on that topic. Now let's talk about how Kohelet saw this and how it affected Kohelet's train of thought and Kohelet's contemplations that he was relating to us over the past few weeks and over the past 7 or 8 or 10 verses. So if you think back to what we discussed, beginning around verse 14, Pasuk Yud Daled, Kohelet had been thinking about his experiences of pleasures and wisdom and so on, and then he had said that he realizes suddenly that he's despairing over all of his efforts in the world. And all of that began when he started really thinking closely about death, when he started thinking about how everything that he's doing in the world and the product and the fruits of all his labors and efforts would ultimately disappear. And not only would they disappear, but he would have no way to control who would get them after he's gone. And there's no way to guarantee that the efforts and the labors that he put in would be followed in the same way and with the same wisdom and with the same goodness and with the same nature that he had wanted his own efforts to be put into this world. And because he loses that control, that's what caused him to realize that the present efforts really are something to despair over too. It was a long train of thought and we talked about it in detail, but that's really where it all began. And the fact that a person expends all of their years and all of their life and all of their efforts in this world towards certain goals and in a certain way, and at the end, it all disappears. At the end, there's just no way to continue it, and everything they've done just disappears. That is really the heart and the source and the root of much of the absurdity in life and much of the more detailed absurdities that can be realized when we think about the specifics of life. And the fact that all of Kohelet's efforts and all of his efforts in the present were something to despair over because he couldn't guarantee the outcome of those efforts, most of that began with the fact that he would die one day. And he realized that everything and everybody, no matter the fool or the wise person, the person who put in good efforts or the person who didn't put in efforts, all of those people would die and all of their efforts would disappear one day. I just want to highlight that for you because it's very key in Kohelet and it's very key in life in general. A lot of what happens revolves around death. And sometimes it's subconscious, sometimes it's conscious, sometimes we don't really think about it. But really life is lived very much in the shadow of death, for worse and for better. Of course, for worse, death is a very negative thing. But in a certain sense, for better, as I explained, because life would not be what it is at all if it wouldn't be lived with death on the other side. Okay, so now let's continue on and finish the last verse, the last pasuk of Kohelet in chapter 2, which is verse 26. So we had talked about how Kohelet had gone through all of his contemplations. He had talked about how he was despairing over all of his efforts. And then he had said at the end of the day, the only way to live with this is to think and to realize that it's impossible to say that all of our efforts in the present moment have no worth and have no value. The other side of that absurdity is that even though it seems that they're difficult and they have no value, but they must have value. There's no way to say that everything we do is just completely crazy and absurd and is meaningless and nothing. And so we have to somehow, we're forced somehow to create value out of them and to create a good experience out of those things that we do, out of our efforts and out of our eating and drinking as a metaphor, out of our experiences and consumptions, we're forced to turn them into something valuable. And there are different ways to do that, and we discussed that in detail the past couple of weeks. And Kohelet had said, we have to live in a way that creates goodness and creates value. There's no way around it. There's no way past it. And if we don't do it, we end up being stuck. And so we're forced into that situation, no matter how absurd it is in a certain sense. But at the end of the day, we're really forced to live that situation and to create goodness out of our experience, to create something that's good to our soul, to our inner reality, and to who we really, really are. Because all we have is really our experience. Our experience really is only our own. It's nobody else's. And in a certain sense, it's everything. What we have and what we are and what's only our own is really everything that's ours. And so we have to create something out of it. And so that brings us to verse 26. And Kohelet continues, Ki la'adam shetov lefanav, nasan chachma v'da'as v'simcha. V'lachote nasan inyan, lesov v'lichnos, v'lasais latov lefnei ha'elohim. Gam zeh hevel u're'us ruach. For to a person to whom it is good, he gave intelligence and wisdom and happiness. But to the wrong, he gave an occupation to gather and accumulate, and to give to the one fit before God. This too is absurdity and a badly spirit. And what Kohelet is saying here is, number one, the person for whom things work out and the person for whom things go well in this world and who's able to make something good, to that person, they have both intelligence and wisdom and also happiness in this world. And therefore, for that person, it's good. But for the person for whom things don't work out and for whom things work badly, that person, all of their work is just empty accumulation, not for their own sake, but ultimately for someone else's sake and for some other's sake, but not for their own, unfortunately. And that too is absurdity and just something terrible when we think about it. That's one way of reading the sentence. And of course, there's another way and other ways that are even deeper, but that carry us forth along the same vein. So let's read it another way. For to the person who is good, for the person who has either good experiences in life, or we can translate it, who's good before God, who does the things they do in this world in a way that's good and that carries forth good and that creates goodness for themselves or for the world or for both. For that person, the way we've explained these many weeks that we've been discussing, that person is able to live their life and to create their efforts and to live their experiences in a way that's good, that's intelligent and wise, but also happy, that creates happiness for them because they live their life in the positive way and in the way that created positive out of their efforts and also positive for themselves. But to the one who unfortunately lives it the wrong way and puts their efforts towards the wrong thing and engages in their effort in a way that doesn't ultimately bring positivity to themselves and to the world, the way we've explained all of these other weeks, that person unfortunately lives on the wrong side of existence. And everything that they do ultimately does not bring positivity to themselves and to the world at the end of the day. And unfortunately for that person, all of their efforts are in vain and they don't really ultimately bring goodness for that person. And that too is the height of absurdity, not to the same level that we explained it the first time, because in this explanation there is some sensibility to what's happening. The good person, so to speak, is living on the good side of the world, and the bad person, so to speak, is living on the unfortunate side of the world. So there is some greater sensibility to this, but there's still some absurdity because at the end of the day, it's still something strange and ultimately something that we really can't fully understand and explain. How there are people that on the one hand work their way through the world in a good way, and other people work their way through the same world and in the same way, and the same things that they do, and the same efforts that they make, and the same ends that they work towards, ultimately are bad for themselves and sometimes even bad for the world. And that too is ultimately absurdity. La kol zman ve'es l'chol chayfetz tachas hashamayim. Kohelet continues the beginning of chapter 3. As we've explained before, the chapter divisions in Kohelet are not original to the book. La kol zman ve'es l'chol chayfetz tachas hashamayim. To everything there is a time, and there's a period for every striving under the sun. And there we move on to one of the most famous passages in Kohelet that's been discussed and sung and stated and put into verse many times over. And we'll get to it next week. And it's beautiful and profoundly interesting, but I'm going to show you something amazing next week. How the way the world explains these verses is true. And there's a time for everything, a time to be born, a time to die, a time for love, a time for hate, a time for war, a time for peace. It's all about man's march through their life and their experience, and humankind's march through the world. There are cycles, and everything is always in flux and constantly changing, which is a continuation of what we just discussed, right? Everybody's experiences in the world are changing, and everybody's experiences are different, and some are good and some are bad, and some start bad and become good, and some start good and become bad. And it's always in flux, and that continues on into the next verse. But I'm going to show you something very profound and very deep, how the message and the way that everybody reads these verses and what's well known to everybody is true. But there are so many more profound truths and beauty beneath those verses, and there's something much, much deeper that Kohelet is telling us about the truth of our existence in the world. And we'll get to that next week. Thank you so much for joining me.